Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you, Harlan. Thank you. So we are, of course, on that last Torah portion of Exodus, Shemot, and Parsha is Pekudei. And hopefully you can see the text at this point. So we were involved in the we were discussing the priestly garments. This is the actual fabrication of the tabernacle. As you're becoming aware, the last sections of Exodus, from two portions following the second portion, following the giving of the Ten Commandments, all has to do essentially with the construction of the tabernacle and its importance and its prominence. I mean, there are five parshiot that all deal with the construction of the tabernacle, and of course the idea, this yearning to bring the divine presence into this world. And these days, with what's going on, boy, that would be pretty amazing if that were ever to happen. So we are talking about the garments of the high priest, and we're talking here about Vaya'asu et hakotnot shesh. So they made the tunics of linen, ma'aseh oreg. They were knitted, knitted work, la'aharon ulevanav, for Aaron and his sons. So there were times, of course, that we were just talking about the clothing of the high priest. He had a very, very special uniform. And here we're talking about his sons as well, that both Aaron and the high priest and the other priests all wore these tunics. And I'm going to show these to you. So here's one way of looking at it. This is there. This is what we're talking about here. So there we are. So you can see this is what the regular priest wore, and this is what the high priest wore underneath. So you could see the white showing. This is the cloak that the high priest had. So you can see that the priest, they had a tunic, they had the sash, and they also had this headdress, which, as you can see, was a little bit different. We can get a better picture of it here. And we're going to deal a little bit with this, the Tzitz HaKodesh, or the Nezer HaKodesh, this holy crown. And I have a few other pictures. Let's take a look at something else. Let's see. Okay, I think this will give it to us a sense. This is the tunic, right? And we'll discuss, this is the sash. This is the ribbon from which the turban or headdress was made. And these are the michnasayim. These are the pants that both the priest and the high priest wore. So these particular garments were shared. Let's go back into the text. Okay. So here we are. The et hamitznefet, and the headdress, shesh, made out of linen, the et pa'arei hamigbaot shesh, and the decorated turbans made out of linen. And I think the reason why it talks about these two different things is that one of them would have been the way in which the high priest wore it, and the other, the regular priest. So this possibly referring to the Kohanim, this possibly referring to the high priest. The et mechnasei, and the trousers, habad, made out of linen again, shesh mushzar, twisted linen, right? So bad also, I believe, means, yeah, so you can see, I'll just show you the Aramaic. They're two different words, but they both refer to linen. So do you see the Aramaic here? It says butza, and then it says devutz. So the same word, right? He has both the same word. He doesn't have a different word in Aramaic for linen. And shazir means twisted. So just referencing it there. Ve'et pa'arei hamigbaot. So it's a little bit, this pa'arei is a little bit difficult to translate. The syntax isn't the easiest in the world, right? Safaria translates it as decorated. I mean, the splendor, if we the word tiferet pa'er, glory, splendor of the headdresses or the turbans, right? So this Rashi's trying to work through the syntax there, and he says tiferet hamigbaot, okay, that is the splendor of these turbans, hamigbaot hamefoarot. So here is the one here's how Safaria possibly gets its translation, right? That because it says the splendid turbans, something like that, right? Of beauty, something like that. And again, headdress is sort of very interesting. The symbolism of hats and caps and headdress in general is extremely significant. It's almost, and perhaps even more significant than other articles of clothing, is how headdress conveys issues of status and importance and authority. And, you think, for example, of course, of a crown, the idea of it being placed on the head. So there's I imagine at least a doctoral dissertation buried somewhere in that into the significance of hats and headdress. So going on. Ve'et ha'avneit, and the sash, sheish moshzar. Again, if I'm not mistaken, I'm thinking, right? Yeah, another word, right? Again, look at this. How our Onkelos is so helpful. Another word. So we've got sheish again, moshzar, of twisted linen. So here, sheish moshzar. See that? Sheish moshzar. Utchelet and blue, for argaman and purple, the tolat shani and crimson yarns. Now shani is possibly silk. Because tolat, this word tolat, because the word tolat means a worm. And so we've discussed this before, that possibly this is referring to silk. Ma'aseh rokem, the work of a embroiderer, or it could possibly mean embroidery work. Kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe, just as the Lord Hashem had commanded Moses. So again, why this phrase, right? This phrase, Kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe, right? To show the continuity of this expression of the fabrication of everything that was done, that there's this seamless transition starting from the divine inspiration or with Moses receiving this divine word and then conveying it, and then, of course, it actually being enacted. So that whole continuity and presence of the divine. So going on, v'ya'asu et tzitz nezer, and they made the frontlet, nezer hakodesh, the holy crown, we can try and translate it as, right? We saw that zahav tahor, of pure gold, vayichtavu alav michtav, and they wrote on it michtav pituchei chotem, script that was the impression of a seal. Kodesh Lashem. This is what they wrote on it. Kodesh Lashem. And let's take a look and see if we can. Here we go. So we'll get a better picture of it, but there's the Kodesh Lashem, right? But of course, he doesn't write out Ladonai, but this is what he's referring to right here. And we'll take another look at it. Let's see here if we have one. Let's see it here. There we go. There's another picture of it. And just take note, though, how it was attached to the head of the priest, of the high priest. Right. Okay. So let's go back into this. Okay, and by the way, did you see, let me just show you one more time quickly. Okay. Right, how how he's done this as like a signet ring, right? You see how the the writing is sticking out like that. I don't know if we'd call it embossed. I don't know if that's the expression we'd use for it. Okay. Let's take a look. There's a very long Rashi on this. Let's see if this is on it right now. Okay, we got one more verse before we have to get in the Rashi. Vayitnu alav ptil tchelet, and they should place upon it a thread of, or a ribbon of blue, latet al hamitznefet, to place on the turban, or the headdress, milamala, above, kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe, just as God had commanded Moses. And we'll take another look here now. Okay. So this is what we're talking about. So you can see how this ribbon went over the headdress as well. And we'll take another look and see how it was tied in on behind. Let's see another angle of it. All right. And this. That's how it was tied in behind. So you can see how there were actually 4 ribbons totally. And then it all got tied back. You'll see Rashi says this actually, according to tradition, was tied, I believe, at Orif, which would be the nape of the neck. And that's not the way it's done here. But it's possible that I'm not understanding perfectly where this went, or it's just for the sake of the model that he's got. So there's some issues here that Rashi needs to address in this comment here. So, latet al hamitznefet milamala, to place on the headdress above, but al yedei haptilim, and it was by means of these ptilim, these ribbons, haya moshivin al hamitznefet, they would place these on the headdress. You saw the picture, kamin keter, as a sort of crown. Ve'if shalomar, and one cannot say, because this is ambiguous, but one cannot argue hatzitz al hamitznefet, that that plate itself, that tzitz, was on the headdress itself. Sha'arei b'shchitat kodshim, he says that in this tractate, shchitat, this is the chapter in a tractate, shchitat kadoshim, the slaughter of sanctified animals. Shaninu, we learned, sa'aro haya nir'eh, that the hair of the high priest was visible, bein tzitz lemitznefet, between this frontlet and the turban. Shesham maniach tefillin, because on this space is where he would place his tefillin. The priest also had to participate there. Let's see if we can see from here. So this is where he put his tefillin, right? There, that his hair was visible. This is, I think, the point that Rashi is trying to make here. And that he places tefillin right there. V'hatzitz haya natun ala metzach, and the frontlet was placed on the forehead. So that's where it was, below the tefillin, the head box of the tefillin. Hare hamitznefet lamala, and so consequently the turban or the headdress was above, v'hatzitz lamata, and here we have the little crown or the frontlet below. Umahu al hamitznefet milamahu. So then, what does it mean to say that it was on the headdress above? How do we understand that phrase? But hod hik hiksheti ba, and he says, I also have another issue, another difficulty. Kan here, sorry, ba. Kan hu omer vayitnu alav ptil tchelet. Here it says they shall place upon it a thread of blue. Uve'inyan hatzva'ah, but when Moses is commanded regarding this tzitz, back in Parshat, I imagine it's in Titzaveh, okay, unless it's in, yeah, I think that's where it would be. Hu Omer, it says, and he says back Exodus chapter 28, V'samta oto al ptil tchelet, you shall place it on the thread of blue. So I imagine this is, we're talking about the commandment regarding the tzitz, right? So there it says you shall put upon it, put the tzitz upon the ribbon, the thread of blue. Omer ani. So the way I understand it, this is Rashi speaking for himself now. Ptil tchelet zeh. This ptil tchelet they're talking about, this blue thread that they're talking about. Chutin hein, we're referring to threads, the kashro bahen, to attach with through those threads, bamitznefet, in the crown. In other words, over the crown. The fisha hatzitz eno ella, because the frontlet eno ella me ozen leozen, because in fact the tzitz only went from one ear to the other ear. Let's take another look here. Okay, so here we go, assuming his ears are here, and this is how the tzitz went on his forehead from one ear to the next. Okay. Uvame yiksharenu. And so what could you attach it with? What could you attach this tzitz b'mitzcho on his forehead? Vahayu kvu'in bo. And so they're attached to this tzitz, chutei tchelet, these threads of blue, lishnei roshav, to its two ends, uva emtsaito, and in its middle. And again, just to refresh your memory, right, we can see here, right? So on either end of this, and then in the middle as well. It's exactly what Rashi is saying. Okay. Shebahen koshro, and through them you attached it, you tied it. V'tolehu b'mitznefet, and you can then hang it, you can suspend the tzitz on the mitznefet, on the turban, keshehu barosho, when it was on his head, ushnei chutin hayu b'chol kiyatzeh v'katzeh, and there were two threads that were on every edge, on every end where it came. Achat mimal, and one above, v'achat mitachat, and one below the tzad mitzcho, right next to his forehead. Okay, so let's take a look carefully. I'll do a little bit more and then we can take a look. V'chein be'emtza'o, and the same in the middle. Okay, let's take a look here. There. Do you see how there were two? So they threaded through. This is the point he's making. So this is actually doubled. There's the one on the outside, and you can't see it, but inside there's another one going back. Here you can see it a lot more clearly, right? How there was one on the outside. It went through an aperture here, and then on the back, on the inside there, the inside here, and of course on the other side as well. It did exactly the same thing. And that's what Rashi is describing now. Let's see, make sure. Shekach hu noach, because this would be easy then, likshor, in order to tie. Yes, David.
Yeah, just really quick. Those are hooks then, right? The thread's going into some sort of aperture or hook, right?
Exactly, right. A little,
okay.
yes. I'm trying to think of what you might call it. I'm sure there's a name that you give these kinds of things. Like if you think of an eye, I guess that's what they called, hooks and eyes, right?
Yeah.
So this would be a little eye that you put on either end of the tzitz, and then this eye in the middle of the tzitz, in the middle at the top of it, right?
Got it.
Where you Yeah. Ve'ein derech kshira, and you cannot tie anything bepachot mishnei chutin, with less than 2 threads. Try and tie something with only 1 thread. If you've ever had a shoelace break, you'll know the frustration. L'chach ne'emar, and for this reason, ne'emar al patil tchelet, for that reason it says on the thread of blue, for alav patil tchelet, and for that reason, in other words, with regard to this this tzitz, right? It says on the blue thread, and it also says for alav patil tchelet, or sorry, yes, and then it says and on it a thread of blue. The kosher rashehem hashnayim kulam yachad, and he ties all these sets of 2 threads together, me'achorav, behind him, the mul or paw, opposite the nape of his neck, right? Moshivo al hamitznefet, and then he places it on the turban. So with the pictures, of course, we can see clearly what's going on here, right? So there we see how it's over there. Give me one moment, and I have a picture of how it looked in the back. There we have it. So now you can see how all of these were tied on the back and then placed like this crown over his. So this is like a big crown, the whole thing. Okay. How carefully Rashi has to describe this, right? Okay. So going on. For al titma, and another issue, he says, don't be surprised. Shelo ne'emar ptilei tchelet. Now he's talking about the grammar of the sentence. He says, don't be surprised that the verse doesn't say ribbons of blue or threads of blue. It just says ptil tchelet, a thread of blue. Or il umerubinheim, and that don't be surprised that despite the fact that there are many of them, it only talks about one. It uses a singular. Because we have other examples where the singular is used in regards to, for example, the breastplate, the ephod, and likewise the ephod. But it says, "Vayarkasu et hachoshen." In other words, something like they attached the breastplate, etc. Okay, and it must have, you'll see, for al korchacha, right? Okay, so since it says they attached the breastplate, right? The breastplate was that square plate that went in front with the stones, for al korchacha, and you have to say, you have it perforce, pachot mishnaim lo, you can't have any less than 2 ways to attach the breastplate. It wasn't hanging by 1 thread, it had to, or 1 chain, it had to hang by 2. Sheharei bishtek tzot hachoshen hayu. Okay, so it says because on the 2 edges of the breastplate, hayu shtei tabaot, there were 2 rings. Okay, shtei tabot hachoshen, so there were 2 rings of the breastplate. Uvavet ktefot, and then onto his 2 shoulders, right? Ha'ephod, of the ephod. Remember, if you can visualize it, the ephod had shoulder straps that went up over his shoulders. I think I can actually show you what we're talking about. Here, these are actually coming from behind. Again, I can show you how it did that. Here are the shoulder straps. Do you see that? Right? That's what he's talking about right now. And they came up over his shoulders. And this is what he's talking about. There were rings here. We read about these, actually, just read about them, and how they were attached then to the shoulder straps. So the point is, right now, we haven't gotten, Rashi hasn't made his final point, but we're getting there. Okay. Hayush de tabaot ha'evot, right? So there were 2 rings on the ephod, shekenegdan, which were opposite them. Ulefi derech kshira, and again, by means of tying, arba chutin. There were a total of 4 of these gold threads. Hayu, they were. Umikol makom, and nevertheless, pachot mishnayim ifshar, and likewise, it would be impossible to have less than two. And I'm going to show you the wind again carefully. What this? So you see how they were two and two, and likewise, there two. You can just see if I can make it a little bigger. You can see how there's two here. They were doubled. And I think that's what Rashi is trying to tell us. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right. And we will stop here today. We will not meet tomorrow. Okay. But we will meet again, please God, on Thursday. And I'm going to pop the arrow here. And put this right here. And I'm going to stop the share. Okay. Any comments before I stop the recording? Okay. I hope that was helpful. I think I could not have done it without the pictures. That's for sure.
How
Okay.
come they say you can't mix linen and wool?
Right. So, Harlan, you may recollect we've mentioned this before, but I'll be happy to explain it. So they actually did mix linen wool in the garments of the high priest. Okay, and because of that, it's a way when you don't do it yourself, it's saying this is reserved for royalty. It's a way of showing deep, deep respect in not doing it yourself and treating yourself in that way. So that's one reason why we're not allowed to mix linen and wool. Now, there are other discussions about it that try to understand, well, is it because linen comes from a plant and wool comes from an animal? And there's this whole idea of mixing species that's forbidden. And possibly, if I were to try to scratch that just a teeny little bit, it would be that we don't want to play God, okay, and mix animal life and plant life together. There may have been some idolatrous practices that went along with that. I'm not aware of those specifically. I do know that the fact that the high priest wore garments of linen and wool is probably significant and had some symbolism. By the way, when it comes to the talit, this talit here, okay, you can have a a um, a wool talit and use silk threads or linen threads, etc., or etc. In the case of the talit, it's the only exception where you can actually mix things. But again, remember the talit is something that is a ritual garment. We aren't using it as something to simply wear. Although there is a talit that you wear as an article of clothing, you might say. But again, there's a dedicated way in which this is done. So thank you for raising it, really, Harlan. I appreciate your raising it again because it is actually a deep subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.